Hello, and welcome to episode 68 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Guam, the U.S. territory in Micronesia, I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's podcast, I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Sean Valles, Associate Professor of Philosophy, specializing in the philosophy of public health at Michigan State University. Sean's research spans a range of topics in the philosophy of population health, from the use of evidence in medical genetics to the roles played by race concepts in epidemiology. His 2018 book, Philosophy of Population Health, Philosophy for a New Public Health Era, explores the ethical and evidentiary questions laying beneath scientific research on the health of human populations, such as, what does it mean to be healthy? How can we make sense of the ways that racism and other social injustices affect health? And how can we more justly distribute health benefits and harms in diverse societies? Sean's teaching relatedly focuses on understanding the goals and limits of biomedical sciences, with such questions as, how are biomedical science and clinical medicine related? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the ways we test the safety and efficacy of drugs? What are the ethical responsibilities of a biomedical scientist? And how do U.S. health challenges compare to other countries' challenges? Sean is also the director of Michigan State University's Science and Society State Program, supporting interdisciplinary faculty collaborations that join the humanities, the arts, and the sciences. I've decided to introduce and bring on Dr. Sean Valles today to discuss his research, in particular as it relates to the public health crisis that is COVID-19. I believe Sean's particular expertise and insights into this crisis are quite prescient. I know I learned a tremendous amount from speaking with him during this call, and I do hope you will in listening to this show. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Sean. Dr. Sean Valles, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this evening?
As good as can be expected. How about you?
Doing fine. So you're calling us from where is it? Where are we? Is it Lansing in Michigan?
Right now I'm in East Lansing, Michigan. Yeah.
Okay. So given the situation, given the circumstances, how are things in East Lansing?
Seems like it's around sort of like in the middle of where things are nationally. So today is the 17th of March. Who knows where this is going to go next? But it's we're at the point where we just switched over to only having carry out restaurants and things like that. We're sort of in that level of social isolation measures.
Yeah. Yeah, it has started to be, this has become more and more real by the day. So perhaps could you tell me a little bit about, I guess your experience to the particular measure. So just for our audience listeners to know, Sean is a philosopher of science at Michigan State University. He's a specialist in philosophy of science, philosophy of public health. And so I'm particularly interested in how these circumstances, this situation have impacted your current work, your current research and teaching. So what has been going on there?
So right now I am fortunate in the sense of not having any ongoing classes. I sort of packed my last semester with my courses in order to have a little bit more time to do research this semester. And that's not quite panning out the way I'd hoped. It's like, I'll give some talks and do some travel and work on the next project. And instead, it's take care of a 3-year-old and try to survive and things like that. So it's been a pretty wild time. The weird thing that's sort of going on in my life. So no matter what I do, I'm sort of dealing with this ongoing COVID-19 crisis. So like so some people can sort of like, oh, I'm going to just focus on work for a little while and take my mind off of other stuff. It's like, well, this is also work for me. And so, there's like no version of this where I'm not thinking about public health.
So tell me about, as a philosopher of public health, I will get into this a little bit more detail, but so what are some perhaps like immediate consequences or immediate questions that come to mind in terms of doing your research, but then having to think about or getting to think about this?
It's interesting because I have to. It sort of forces me to think about how to basically contextualize what's happening inside the area that I focus on. So my main area isn't infectious disease, and so there's at least that sort of going on. But my main interest, and I assume we'll get more into this, is essentially on social conditions, social determinants of health, how different living conditions and access to healthcare and equity, and who has access to money and who doesn't, that sort of thing. How that shapes the health of societies. And so the connection there is starting to come to the surface in national discourse in ways that it sort of wasn't before. And so it's interesting having people start having conversations about like, oh, maybe it would be a good idea, at least just for now, to have like paid leave for people who are sick. Like
maybe.
Yes, that could be a good move. Like, let's keep talking about that. Maybe 12, 18 months from now, we can keep that conversation going. Like, so about that whole paid sick leave thing.
Yeah.
How about that? Or like, let's stop turning off people's water for at least for the next few months if they don't pay their bills. Like, well, maybe people get water all year round, all the time. So it's interesting seeing it be sort of, in some sense, tangential to the area of public health that I work in, but also it's also like right there underneath everything. Yeah. And so it's just sort of forcing me to constantly be thinking about like what are these connections and how I sort of want to process what's going on around me, and then like how is this going to? I mean, this is going to have to be a sort of a defining event in the history of public health for like every paper in philosophy of public health henceforth will talk about this event.
Well, we saw this with a series of events. I remember September 11th with Katrina, with mass events that affected a large number of people, other natural disasters, etc. But this could be this is essentially unprecedented. We haven't seen something like this. Are you finding yourself as an expert in public health or as a scholar of public health? Have you been asked by friends and family, by colleagues, etc., your takes at the moment?
Yeah, they have been asking, and it's nice. It's a little weird people, I think sometimes people working in public health can get a bit of an inferiority complex that like it's sort of the unloved piece of the health world or something like that. So like, at least in the United States, it varies by national context, but in the US, we don't give a lot of love to public health kinds of things. People who work in public, physicians, surgeons, they sort of have their high status occupations, but people say like, I work in public health, I work for the health department. It's not like a very sexy kind of job.
I was just going to ask if you have any thoughts of why you believe that public health isn't necessarily outside of perhaps working, as in a top tier position in the CDC, in bioterrorism or something like that. What is particularly why isn't public health given its due as much as other professions or lines of research in the health professions?
I think there are a variety of different reasons. I'll sort of focus on this in the U.S. context because it just varies by place and context. So in the U.S., I think we kind of concentrate some of the different factors into making them even stronger than they are individually. So the dominant conception of health and how to think about it and how to deal with it in the U.S. is sort of the biomedical. It's the biomedical model where we have thinking about health is some sort of part in individual body's machinery breaks, and hence we need to fix that piece of the machinery. And who is that best done by? It's done by some sort of collaboration between bench scientists working inside laboratories and clinicians working as physicians, and basically everything else is sort of left to the side. And so even within medicine, people who work in preventive medicine sort of feel like they're kind of getting pushed out of the picture. And it's like, well, okay, we still care about you if you're developing a drug that will lower cholesterol. That's preventive medicine. Like, yes, that is too. But there's less attention on trying to do things like non-pharmaceutical interventions, is the way it's sometimes put. So ways of trying to improve health that don't involve pills and biomedically things or something like that. So there's not a lot of room inside. I say inside at least U.S. health discourse for things like community health workers and making sure that people have access to fresh fruits and vegetables and clean housing. And it only sort of pops up sporadically. And the fact that it sort of seems unusual at the time that it sort of pops up as like a national incident is sort of like a partially a sign of like how much it isn't cared about the rest of the time. So like there's a problem with lead piping throughout the United States. Some places have it much worse than others, but a lot of people are receiving basically undesirable amounts of lead inside their water. Ideally, we would want basically none. But then when Flint, all of a sudden there's like a single crisis where there was some decisions that were being made by particular people inside the government and really just horribly harming certain people. And it's all tied in with this very toxic relationship between the state and the city, taking away their voting rights, all that sort of thing. So then it sort of becomes part of a national conversation. And like, oh, the Flint water crisis. Like, well, that's only one incident that's in part of a bigger picture. But the people who are doing so it's interesting sort of seeing like at moments we sort of have this attention to things like safe drinking water, but then it goes away again. And it's only in that one single contained context.
Yeah, what does it feel like to be a researcher who then it's like the light is the magnifying glass is cast on this very narrow issue, but then there's a whole mess of other issues that it's I don't know what what is your I suppose what do you think, or what is your message perhaps to the general public about that?
I mean, so I'm still sort of thinking about how I want to frame all of this for my future research. Like, I've been putting a lot of thought into this over the last few days. But I mean, so one of the things is the way I sometimes talk about epidemics is I see them as, including the current pandemic, is they're essentially stress tests on a society. And so an epidemic is basically going to show you where the cracks already are and is going to worsen them. Mm-hmm. And so it's really interesting seeing the way those cracks are starting to form right now, and they're getting wider and wider, and it's extremely disconcerting seeing what's happening. So like the food service industry is just getting absolutely pummeled, and so many people are going to be furloughed or laid off or just have no source of income for the foreseeable future. And so like we can talk about sort of bits and pieces of this issue, and we can talk about like paid sick leave. Like that would be really great to have. Yeah. But even if we address some of these things, even if we didn't have like particular industries being basically decimated by the pandemic, we still wouldn't be addressing the fact that in the United States, depends on what kind of measure you use, but basically the majority of households are one paycheck away from financial ruin. And so the majority of the country lives paycheck to paycheck. And so what we have is basically a society that is not at all resilient. There are different ways of conceptualizing it. So like resilience, I think is one way of thinking about it, that like we are not ready for the shock of any kind of thing that hits us as it hits our society. And we could have been better prepared, and some societies are prepared better than others in different ways. But we had the veneer of things working fine, like, oh, we have a great economy or something like that. But stagnant wages and I mean, it sounds more or less absurd depending on who you say it to. This idea that that things were going great 2 months ago or something like that. And so
things were fine. Everything was great. Yeah.
So it's really, so if we're going to survive another one of these, because there's always going to be another one, and it's going to be like you said, it's going to be a Katrina, or it's going to be a pandemic, or whatever it is. Like, if the majority of people are like, they cannot miss work next month, otherwise they will not be able to make rent. That's not a society that's going to be able to sustain whatever it hits it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Among other things, but that's just sort of one that's sort of like looming right there, is like that everyone has to go to work every single day, otherwise it's just like it's the end.
Well, thank you for your thoughts and reflection, Sean. So before actually we go further into and dive deeper into COVID-19, I think it would be actually interesting to keep a sense of normalcy, especially even on this podcast, and go back a little bit to doing a little of what we do, which is come to know you as a researcher and how you got into this field of philosophy of science and particularly philosophy of public health. So let's take a step back just briefly and talk a little bit about Sean. So where did you grow up, and how did growing up where you did, and how did you get into philosophy of public health to begin with?
Okay, so I grew up in a combination of Newton, Massachusetts, and also Los Angeles. I was born in Newton, which is right outside of Boston, and then moved to Los Angeles, and then moved back again. Basically, I spent my elementary school years in Los Angeles. I originally went to a math and science magnet school inside when I was in Los Angeles, and I really got into mathy and sciencey things. I kept up that interest throughout high school, although I took a one or maybe even two philosophy courses when I was in high school, and I got a bit into that and started doing that thing that future philosophy majors do. Which is to start like picking up random books and start getting into it, and reading some philosophy and other pieces of literature. I read some political science and things like that. I would go to the local college bookstore and start like reading through stuff, like being a giant nerd.
What kind of books? What were you up to?
Let's see. What was I? Lao Tzu. Let's see. I read a lot of Lao Tzu. I was a big fan of like all Taoist texts, and I still remain a fan. I'm a big fan of the Zhuangzi, which is really sort of like influential on me when I was growing up. And then I decided I wanted to go to college somewhere that would sort of be supportive of my sort of nerdy, book loving kinds of interests. So I went to St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, and did their Great Books program, where essentially you just sort of make your way through the leather-bound library of the Western classics. Mm-hmm. I sort of loved it and sort of hated it. It was a very interesting time for me. I got to study history of math and science and read original Galileo and Plato and things like that, and read Plato in ancient Greek and all that stuff, which was a lot of fun. It was also a I wasn't quite prepared for the sort of socially and politically and all sorts of other intellectually conservative sort of place it was. And so it was never quite my scene. I ended up being a student newspaper columnist, writing about how alienating I found the whole place.
Wow. So we've had a few folks who have attended the St. John's, who have been part of the St. John's, because there's a few campuses, right? That
there's also a one in Santa Fe.
Right. Yes. Could you say maybe perhaps a little bit more about what was so perhaps alienating about it?
It's unusual among liberal arts colleges because it's majority male, which is again unusual in the liberal arts scene. It's extremely white, and this is a podcast, so you can't quite see that I'm not fully there. Right. So it was the sort of the, and it was also the social scene had a very sort of like, it was strongly influenced by essentially an evangelical Christian group that had like a lot of sway over sort of the social scene. There were other groups too, and not everyone was sort of part of that, but I sort of could feel sort of like a weird political undercurrent that sort of being largely continuous with sort of like the emergence of the sort of the alt-right now.
Oh boy.
Sort of like a protect Western civilization kind of thing, which some people go to a great book school because they want the Western part of it. Others go to it because they want the books part of it, which is sort of why I was there.
Yeah.
So it was interesting even then sort of seeing like how like a bunch of people with very, very different interests can sort of converge in a single location. And it just sort of, it was a fascinating time for me, and it was like I got amazing skills there, but it was also I needed to find something that would be closer to what I was looking for. I wasn't quite sure what that was. I started asking around. I was essentially a laboratory assistant throughout most of my time there. And I eventually ended up being told to go to Indiana University for the History and Philosophy of Science program.
Oh, I've heard of that program. It's a great program.
Indeed, it was actually the only place I even got into. I was waitlisted a couple other places, and I really liked it. I originally was sort of torn between doing something in doing something related to biology and maybe something related to physics. I sort of quickly decided to do something related to essentially philosophy of human genetics. Soon after I arrived, I started working with Lisa Lloyd pretty early on, and sort of carried on that interest, and eventually wrote a dissertation on why are there common genetic diseases, because evolution says that basically there shouldn't be common terrible things that kill you, because natural selection should be eliminating them from populations.
Huh.
All things being equal, but they're not all equal. So I was interested in sort of that sort of controversy over like how do we get things like cystic fibrosis being so common, things like that.
Yeah.
From there, I started applying to jobs, and some of them in philosophy of biology, some of them in philosophy of science, and a couple of them in philosophy of medicine. And I applied to a place that saw that what I was doing as being continuous with philosophy of medicine, although I, in some sense, don't really do philosophy of medicine. I'm on the organizing committee of the Philosophy of Medicine Roundtable, but I say that I do philosophy of health, not philosophy of medicine.
Yeah, so I thank you for sharing. Yeah, this very sound trajectory, and it's interesting to know that Indiana University is now the History and Philosophy of Science and Medicine program.
Which I only learned that recently. It's like, oh, well, what an interesting transition.
I think. I mean, there's enough folks like your former, I believe, advisor, or at least chair, dissertation committee, Elizabeth Lloyd, who's done philosophy of biology as it relates to medicine, and then we have some historians of medicine as well. But
right,
yeah, but thank you for actually making. I'm very curious about the distinction as to what you see as, I suppose, is the distinction between doing philosophy of medicine and then philosophy of health, and in your case, public health.
Yeah. So the way my research has sort of eventually sort of focused on what I've been doing now, basically. It's work that was leading into my book, and then forward from there on philosophy of population health. Philosophy of population health is basically a spin-off or a reaction to public health models, public health frameworks, saying that essentially it's not just all about medicine. So I sometimes, when I'm being a little flippant, I'll say I'm a philosopher of it's not just medicine.
And what does it mean here?
Whatever health sort of framework one wants to use, or biomedical things or health things or something like that. It's trying to have conversations like when I enter a room full of philosophers of medicine, and I don't get a huge amount of pushback inside those rooms, but it is interesting to sort of work in the health field in general, but not really to work precisely in medicine. It's most acute if one goes to something like a bioethics conference, which bioethics, especially medical ethics, the difference between those is already a little bit hazy. But if you go to sort of like a mainstream bioethics conference, the presumption is that one works in sort of clinical medicine, and sort of the very, very traditional model would be like something about the interaction between the doctor and the patient, capital letters. And so what are the aspects of that relationship? How do they share knowledge, and who trusts whom, and things like that? And then my interest has for a long time been who actually gets to go inside a hospital, and who is trusted for which reasons. Is it because the person has different color skin, or because they are distrusted because of their gender? Or so that's sort of continuous with the sort of work that Lisa Lloyd worked on, and I was sort of prepared for that in graduate school. And so I got more and more into looking at sort of the bigger picture of what kind of frameworks are being offered out there inside the scientific world, inside the health sciences world, for how can we think about and do health work better, that's not presuming that every answer is going to come inside a pill, or that or the physicians should be the ones that are directing the process of deciding where we go next with our health, or something like that.
Excellent. So I imagine that some of these and more are featured in your Philosophy of Population Health, Philosophy for a New Public Health Era book, coming out in 2018. So yeah, could you maybe perhaps say, if you haven't necessarily already, describing some of the main either take homes in the book, or the ways in which the book has what you hope it serves as, I suppose.
Yeah, that's a good question, because it was a very different kind of book that I was writing than the sort of work I'd done before. So I was largely trained in the tradition inside philosophy of science of basically doing something like a critical analysis of some sort of work, some sort of trajectory inside science. And so I would do things like write a paper about the early growth of 23andMe and similar kinds of companies, about how they sort of used rhetoric surrounding genetic testing, making it a consumer product, saying why it's good for people to test their genes for susceptibility to various sorts of diseases, and eventually they spread into working in ancestry work, things like that. Mm-hmm. And so I sort of done most of my work in that vein of here, sort of like a critical take on something where it's in some sense sort of valenced as negative, where like, please don't do this bad thing because it's bad, or if this isn't, you're basically making some sort of mistake as a scientist or whatever like that. And that wasn't the extent of everything I'd done, but it was sort of the usual way I operated. And then it was interesting because when I started working on this field of population health, it was me basically spending some time with people who actually work inside population health. I spent part of a summer at the University of Edinburgh Medical School, where they have a program they have a Center for Population Health Sciences, which I think has now changed its name marginally. And so I had been doing work not even related to my book directly there, and I was working on racial and ethnic health them and conceptualize them, things like that. And so it was after I returned to the U.S., I started thinking like, oh, Center for Population Health, like, what does that even mean?
Right.
And so I sort of spent more and more time getting into this literature on what is population health and what's the difference between that and public health. And so I sort of gradually got a sense, because I'd already sort of been partially immersed in it, getting a sense for what exactly was at stake in this dispute over what is a population health framework or a population health approach to things. And the basic idea is that I think they're onto something, and that they have basically a superior way of thinking about and responding to health. And so I started writing a book essentially trying to untangle some of the ideas that hadn't been quite philosophically sort of like worked out, and also give a bit of a signal boost for it, because I think they were and are largely doing the right thing. And so since the 1990s, it's basically been this movement. Started in Canada, and it sort of made its way outward from there. And the basic idea is that if we want to basically make vast improvements inside the health of societies, that if we want to basically do more than improve rounding errors, then we're going to have to make structural changes to the way our societies are set up. And so the catchphrase that's often used is a culture of health. That's been spread, especially by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is very much into this idea. But what that means is there's sort of this grand cultural challenge of improving health. And so it would be something like, how can we have working conditions that are actually conducive to health? Because pretty much anybody who has a job knows that there are all sorts of ways that our jobs are not conducive to good health, whether it's the stress we face every day when we go to work, or the fact that we don't have sick leave, or the fact that we don't have living wages, or that we would work more or we would work less, but childcare is prohibitively expensive. All these sorts of like bigger issues. And so thinking about the way that the societies that we've built basically structure people's decisions and actions and exposures such that it's basically almost an inevitability that poor health will result from it. And so like living as someone inside the United States, it's easy to sort of just walk down the street and see all essentially the bad decisions that were made, or at least non-health conducive decisions that were made about, like, oh, let's design our roads so that design our cities so that you have to have a car in order to get anywhere. How much will it cost to own a car? Oh, it's going to be expensive. And how many child care facilities will there be? Like oh, there will be some, but there will be really high turnover because they won't be paid very well. And like, what if we paid them more? It's like, oh, then nobody could actually afford to have childcare. So like all these sort of details, or what kinds of restaurants you pass, whether or not you can get to a grocery store, how much the vegetables cost versus all the other foods that have certain subsidies attached to them. Yeah. Like all of these decisions all go into basically what makes people able to live a happy, healthy life or not.
Absolutely. It's as you began to describe this structure of health, of culture of health, is my own biases became apparent, because immediately one of the things you were kind of describing, I'm like, oh, so you're talking about like preventative medicine, right? Like prevention.
Yeah.
But but then my immediate thought is like, no, actually, it sounds like you're describing something much more far-reaching and distinct. Would I be correct in assuming that?
Yeah, so the attempt to do things like shift more medical resources toward prevention as opposed to basically putting out fires after they've already started.
Right.
So trying to prevent fires is always nice. So giving people advice and resources so that they can avoid heart disease is like sort of an easy one. Like, it's better to prevent heart disease than to treat it, fairly obviously. But then some of this, the catchphrase that's sometimes used, or sort of the framework that's sometimes used, is health in all policies. Mm-hmm. And so it is possible to basically put health on the agenda when we're doing essentially any kind of policy making. And so whether it's how to tweak the tax code, or the zoning of which kinds of residences or commercial buildings can be put in a particular place. How do we handle advertising, for what, to whom, all these kinds of decisions. These are all things that have impacts on people's health, and you can sort of, like, after they're already done, then you can sort of look retrospectively. Well, I guess it actually made a huge impact on people's health if we build this giant highway through the middle of the city, and it increased driving, and then it gave less motivation for people to have public transportation, and then that disadvantaged people who were relying on public transportation. All these sorts of impacts. You can look at them retrospectively, and you can sort of come up with a story. You're like, oh, I guess that had health impacts. Well, that's something we can do all the time.
Absolutely.
Like, we can actually think about this like proactively.
I mean, has this all come in terms of like the public perception of population health? Like, is it really all the case that the biomedical model is essentially what is keeping folks from understanding the conception of, let's say, the design of a freeway as connecting that with folks' impacts on health?
I mean, if you, I'm happy to rant about this all day, but I think one of the turning points actually was so I was and remain a big supporter of basically the healthcare reforms under the. So basically, a great move towards actually trying to get coverage for trying to tinker with the existing system in order to get health coverage for not quite everybody, but for a lot more people, and also make some essentially changes under the hood, so to speak, inside the medical system with trying to incentivize prevention, among other things.
Yeah.
So that was a great move. What the huge missed opportunity that I rail about all the time is that since that point, we've had a lot of discourse around trying to come up with a system for having universal healthcare, which is fantastic. I think healthcare is a human right, and it should be given to everybody. It should. Something else I can talk about all day. What happened as a really nasty side effect is that I think that somehow ended up taking up all of the room inside health discourse inside society. So that there was this sort of tacit assumption, and it hasn't been corrected by a whole lot of people, that if we were to get healthcare for everyone, then that would actually fix our health problems. And so it can be both morally necessary that we have morally, economically, all sorts of other reasons necessary to have healthcare for everyone. And we also need to improve our health radically.
Right.
In the United States, we would need to make massive improvements even to just catch up to other countries that are doing like a mediocre job. So that presumption that I take that presumption to be fairly widely made, including by people who are like sort of strong advocates of healthcare reform, that we need healthcare reform and we need health reform, but they only partially overlap. And so it's frustrating to try to have conversations where, like, yes, we need Medicare for all or something like that. Like, that's a great idea for all sorts of policy reasons. But that's also not going to buy us all the things we want it to buy for us. And so it's going to take more than that. And that's a hard conversation to have.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really useful for helping to understand this. Especially some of the discourse at least for the past election cycle, the focus has been entirely on medical care for all. We actually, I perhaps maybe you could point us to either elected either health experts or their representatives who are championing a culture of health. Because to be honest, I haven't really. Well, maybe I might be the wrong person to ask, but. I just don't see that as much as being advocated for, and
some of it's going to. Since I do believe in sort of so there's a both descriptive and a normative part in this idea of health in all policies, and so one is just descriptive, hey, the decisions you make in all sorts of policies are going to impact health, and so just make them wiser. And the other one is normative, where it's yes, we need to actually have health discourse inside all of our policy making so that we don't have sort of unintended consequences out later on. And so some of the policy positions that are being put out by candidates are in some sense good health policies. They're just not being framed that way. So things like there have been policies put forward about how to improve access to childcare. That's a big one. That is going to have health impacts because anything that's going to try to improve the conditions of prenatal, postnatal, perinatal health, basically. So the health of people before, during, and after the birth process, and then especially basically anything that's going to affect the early life, such that children have the resources they need. They have food. They have someone to take care of them. They have they have a safe place to live. Those sorts of things are going to have impacts throughout a person's life for all the obvious reasons that basically what we do early in a person's life can have big impacts later on. Mm-hmm. And so so things like that are going to have big health impacts, but they're not necessarily being sold as that. They're being sold as it's part of having a more equitable society. It's part of having justice, having rights for women. So it's also that.
Yeah,
but there's some any kind of changes to having living wages be better. Union protections are also health policies insofar as it is unions that got us most of the safe working conditions, such as they are, that we have now. And there's plenty of evidence that when you erode any kind of collective bargaining, then you have the possibility for workplaces to become less safe, for them to work people for longer hours, or force them to work overtime, or to not let them get paid sick leave, and so then they show up to work sick, and so all these sorts of things. So So there are policies that are being put out that would be sort of like that people could say like, yes, that is going to be a healthier policy by whatever measure, but that's not linking up with the way it's being talked about, at least during this election cycle, at least as far as I've seen.
Right. No. Yeah, I would agree. Well, I think it's probably perhaps time. These things have been in the background of our discussions, but why don't we turn things back to COVID-19 and to discuss about as a philosopher of population health, as someone who's interested in this culture of health, and I should say also, I imagine you discuss attending things like bioethics conference and meetings, and so it's the case just for our listeners. You're, as a philosopher of population health, you interact not only with philosophers but other health professionals. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right. So excellent. So I guess So perhaps tell us. I guess maybe a couple of things in terms of what. I guess, well, I'll just ask the general question. What do you find yourself thinking about during these times? What has been, in particular, I suppose, in narrowing down to your research, but what do you find yourself focusing in to be some of the most important features of this time?
So what my mind is sort of drawn to now, and this is literally just over the last few hours, because I've been sort of thinking about like, okay, like what next is for my research and things like that.
Good question.
I am a bit tempted to actually write a book on something like COVID-19 and the ethics of rebuilding for health resilience, or something to that effect. So, hot off the presses, of just ideas as far as I'm sort of kicking around, because whatever the aftermath is of this pandemic, and it's going to be horrible. It's also going to be an opportunity, and not necessarily one that will be used well, but it will at least be an opportunity for the possibility of having some bigger conversations about how to build a society that doesn't have something like this happen again. Yeah. So like it's weird saying that even as of the recording of this, that like things are ramping up and they're getting worse and worse, and there are already horrible repercussions, even just from people losing their jobs in anticipation of this sort of thing happening. So like that's it's already bad, and like there's every reason to believe it's going to get much, much worse. So whatever the aftermath of this is going to be, it's already interesting seeing that there is conversation around things like having some sort of minimum income for people. Like, hey, people should have enough money over the next while in order to make it. And so
this morning they're actually they're thinking about it, or they're
So it's like we should just send checks to everybody. It's like, yes, that is a thing you could do, or like having paid sick leave, and like thinking about working conditions actually being safe, or in the city of Lansing, which is the next city over, there's a newly instituted policy, I believe, of basically reducing police presence such that ramping down police responses to things like property crimes, and sort of having them focus primarily or exclusively on things that are basically endanger people's lives.
Wow.
Which is in one sense like very scary that like they're even sort of ramping down police presence, but it's also
right. Yeah.
My honestly, my first reaction was like, oh, well, that's an interesting start. Like, what would happen if we actually use this moment to think about like, well, what actually is a necessary police presence, and what do we want out of the police as opposed to some other sort of way of organizing society? Like, do we want the same people responding to like threats of life and death, or someone's taking somebody's stereo, or taking like their Amazon package off their porch?
Right.
And so there can be so many opportunities for having conversations about what counts as necessary, and what kinds of things are desirable inside a society. And so it's already started to sort of peek through when you have there are people saying like, all those meetings that people said we had to have are obviously not necessary because like we still have a business or whatever it is we still have our office operating now in some sense without having those meetings. And so seeing certain things go away, we're starting to sort of get a sense for which things we took for granted, or some people took for granted while other people never took them for granted. And now they're like, oh, so now you have housing insecurity. What's that like?
Yeah.
So it's gonna be interesting sort of having that moment to sort of like having this big sort of natural experiment of like having this big deprivation that's going to be really really harmful. And this isn't like some sort of silver lining for like a horrible thing. This is like there is going to be some sort of reckoning for thinking about like, okay, so now what do we really want and need? And so I think it would be nice to have a chance to reevaluate that, because it was due anyways, and apparently it's being forced upon us by the fates or whatever.
So you mentioned, so something I also want to ask you. So you've talked about having done work in it, or have some particular interest on the discourse surrounding public health, and so I'm wondering if you could maybe comment a bit on the current discourse that you see around COVID-19, and I suppose it could be related to public health, but if there's anything that you want, anything critical you'd like to say, or any thoughts that you have regarding the communication, the sharing of information along those sorts of lines.
Hey, I got a lot of thoughts on this. So I since I was in the same, again, this IU HPS program, or HPSM now, is it HPSM?
HPS, yeah, I think so. We had, yeah.
So since I was in the history and philosophy of science program, it's I try to think about things historically as much as I can, and to put them into a historical context. So sort of thinking historically, one thing that really worries me is seeing already like bits and pieces of the way things can go really badly when you have a pandemic. And so I'm really worried about basically xenophobic discourse and hate crimes. So that's something that worries me very deeply. And so there's already this tendency that there's basically it's being used as a political statement to attribute COVID-19 and to use the wrong name for it, and to attribute it to China or to Wuhan or some. And so
I don't even want to say the term. It's just
attributing the pandemic to a place historically has always been a move to other, and to in the sense of like as a verb to try to shun and to push away and say like, oh, you are different. It happened with the 1918 pandemic, the flu pandemic. It sort of picked up this name as the Spanish flu pandemic, even though it was not in any sense a Spanish flu any more than anywhere else. It just happened to be the one place where reporting about it continued to go on despite censorship. And so this move to try to blame peoples and places is deeply disturbing, because that move is being basically endorsed by people in power, and that's really terrifying to me, because I don't want to have elected officials who are basically endorsing xenophobia and racism, but like here we are. So I'm worried about that getting worse before it gets better, because other things are going to get worse before they get better. So that's something that really worries me. I'm a professor, and so I interact with a lot of professors virtually now, because I don't really interact with much of anybody outside of my home now. But I'm worried about, and I wrote a public Facebook post about this, so I don't mind sort of like repeating now. I'm really worried about what happens when professors start to bring COVID-19 into their classrooms as a topic. And so I'm really, in some sense, there's like a bit of a sour grapes feel to it, and I'm trying to like not have it be about that, with like all of a sudden everyone cares about public health, and it's like, it's like so students, let me tell you about the importance of public health, like which just started being important 3 weeks ago.
I think you're allowed some sour grapes. Yeah, I think some kind of some. Not I told you so, but like really, it took like the world, like this happening to. I kind of.
Yeah, so I'm trying to not have it be that, but it's But I am worried about. I see this come up sometimes when colleagues will sort of take up issues like race or something like that, because they have some minimal amount of training related to race or something like that, and they like want to bring race into their classroom. It's like, I want to teach a unit on this. It's like, I don't know if you're actually qualified to do that, and if you mess it up, you're really going to hurt somebody. And so I tell them basically the same thing about race as I'm telling them about COVID-19, which is like you are playing with fire, and I want you to be really, really careful about what you do inside this space. And so if you go to the front of a classroom and you say, "Here is the way race really works," then you better know what you're doing. And you better be aware of what the scholarly discourse on it is, and like it's something I've studied intently. I've written papers on race. I've written with people who are like a sociologist of race, and so like that's something I put a lot of effort into. And so there is a bit of sort of like an offense that I take at like this is what I do as a living. Like I study these things and I write papers on them and I publish them, that sort of thing. And so trying to set that aside when I see people going into these things and then just just sort of bumbling into them.
Yeah.
Then I'm worried about if math teachers and stats teachers start teaching like logarithmic growth using COVID-19 parameters or something like that. And yes, that's in some sense a great illustration about the way growth curves work and how you can have exponential or logarithmic growth and things. But also, you don't want to give people the false impression that that's the only way this epidemic could go. You don't want to give people a sense about what that means for how many people are going to get hurt or going to die from it. And so, I'm really worried about people sort of bringing bits and pieces of COVID-19 stuff into classrooms and not being able to answer questions when someone says "Hey, but is this the way it works?" or "Are you saying this?" Or I'm especially worried about the questions that don't get asked. I learned in my class that. I don't know. So I'm really worried about COVID-19 hobbyism, I guess.
Ooh, I like that. So in terms of, I could certainly understand the concern about that. I guess so. And I must say, for some reason, I must have missed the Facebook post, but I've heard it referenced of very good things about it. Melissa actually happened to discuss it with me. But so do you have any recommendations for instructors? Other professionals who do have an audience of some kind in terms of how to be cautious, how to approach discussion of COVID-19, either in the classroom or outside of it.
Yeah, so there's a difference between not dealing with it and not teaching it. So at the moment, anyways, teaching is going to be dealing with it intently all the time. But it's a question about what you're going to be doing with it. And so there's a difference between saying that I have something important to say about here is how flattening the curve works. This is the terminology that's used inside epidemiology for trying to reduce the number of basically the stress that's put on the healthcare system by having lots of people get sick at the same time. So if you don't have anything new to say about that or anything basically educated to say about that, then don't try to reiterate the same point other than just point people to existing resources that know a lot more than you do. So give them websites, send them to the World Health Organization, something like that. That's a perfectly good thing you can do. But if you really want to, but for professors, and this works for a lot of other people too, instead of trying to explain it in a way that you are not basically prepared to do. Don't try to mansplain COVID-19 or something similar. What you can do is to try to actually help people. So if you're teaching students, find out whether or not they actually have safe housing, because a lot of them have houses that would not by any sense be called safe. If you want to be supportive of someone, help them problem solve the fact that their computer isn't working well. Or to talk to them about getting some sort of resources that they didn't realize were available to them. I'm really worried about mental health for lots of people, but especially the students that I deal with. Yeah. And so basically, this is this massive stressor that's being put upon essentially the entire world, and so it's going to exacerbate all sorts of mental health problems. And while at the same time, we're also reducing people's connections to each other. And so if you add stress and you remove basically physical connections between people, then what's the what do you get when you sort of have that equation? It's not going to be good.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you want to be helpful to somebody, like help them get access to mental health care, get them access to it, help them find a clinician, or have a conversation with them, check up on them, tell them that you care about them. Like, don't let people become isolated in the bad way as opposed to the good way. So these are ways. So like anyone can be helpful to other people, and that doesn't require sort of pretending to have expertise or knowledge that we just don't have.
Right.
And so like we can all be responsible human beings or citizens, and not the sort of creepy nationalistic sense, like being good citizens of a society.
Yeah.
But that doesn't require sort of like well, let me tell you about COVID-19. Like, please don't do that if you don't know what you're talking about.
I really actually appreciate you then filling me in. This is actually clarified. So I'm currently teaching a critical thinking class, but I have 2 weeks until our online classes begin again, and I have been thinking what I felt this like a sudden responsibility of like I need to have the intelligible things to say, but I am not an infectious disease expert. I know very little about these things, but the students are kind of looking, and especially in the particular class. But I think you make a lot of really good points in terms of actually how you can practically be helpful. I love that idea of not actually needing to pretend to be an expert. Is really some strong words of advice.
It's a hard thing for people and people doing teaching, people like professors or people sort of playing any kind of academic role, because you feel the pressure to perform by saying like, well, I want to give people answers, but the danger is that whatever you say at the front of a classroom is generally going to be presumed to be accurate, which is a terribly scary thing. But I'm sure you have all sorts of interesting things to say about mental health, for instance, that would be useful for to understand. So that's not to devalue everyone who does anything other than what I do. That's a ridiculous thing. And even I don't work primarily in infectious disease. But again, though, the point is like find something that you do have something to say about, or just help somebody, because both are valuable.
Well, that's perhaps that's one of the things I have actually been considering is my focus is in mental health, but in terms of, so I guess what are you thinking about in terms of encouraging in being concerned about your students' mental health and the mental health of others, and what folks can do, especially in times where social distancing practices are encouraged, remaining at home, not going to take necessarily. So let's say mental health professionals are now doing, perhaps sometimes offering teleconferencing, but not everybody has a laptop where they can teleconference in to their mental health professional, or they can't go to the gym. So what do people do to attend to their mental health?
I'm very cautious around the discourse around basically having people attend to their own mental health. My ideal world would be that other people would attend to them. So rather than sort of put the onus on people to basically undepress themselves.
I've heard about this. The onus of you need to love yourself before you love. It's like no. Yeah, I've heard about this.
Yeah. So I mean, there's some good work out there on this. Jonathan Kaplan has a nice paper on basically the industry of self-care, and that's in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal from last year or so. And the way it's that sort of rhetoric of you're depressed because you have a stressful job and bad living conditions, and so you should do yoga or something like that. That's that sort of. And the problem is well, are you are you doing enough yoga? It seems pretty bad. So what I would given the sort of the current situation, I would really urge people to check on their friends and their family members and just have conversations. And my understanding of this is that when people are feeling are having a really rough time, just having someone reach out to them and express care for them can be a really transformative experience. Just someone saying hey, how are you doing? Would you like to talk? Let's have a quick Skype chat or watch a movie together or something like that. So you're not alone, and so you don't feel like there's no one out there who cares about you. That seems like that can be really a very important thing, and it's people mental health as a general rule, all the sort of mental health related challenges, they sort of fluctuate. And so you have up times and down times. And so trying to reach out to people when they might be at a downtime and sort of seeing how they're doing is an act of kindness that you can do for somebody.
Thank you, Sean. Well, thank you so much for chatting with us. Why don't we conclude with the final question, but we'll tailor it a little bit to COVID-19. Is what do you see, I suppose, as the greatest challenge for philosophers of science and related fields as a result of and living in a world now that we've experienced such a pandemic such as this?
So since before all this, I've been sort of getting into the field or into the discussion inside the philosophy of science literature on socially relevant or socially engaged philosophy of science.
Yes.
And COVID-19, I'm not sure how much of an effect that's going to have at, I don't know, like how many talks are going to be dealing with it at the next Philosophy of Science Association meeting. I just don't know.
Right.
I would be surprised if it were a good number in some way or another, probably mostly indirectly or like certain bits and pieces. I think it's just one of many different reasons why I see an impetus to actually start having more philosophy of science deal directly with issues of the day. It doesn't have to be sort of chasing whatever's happening inside the news cycle, but my personal interest in philosophy of science is how it relates to things that are happening out there right now, affecting real people. And I'm a bit of an extreme in the sense that like I sort of migrated away from doing work in philosophy of medical genetics because I basically decided that that's not where the action is happening when it comes to what's actually driving people's health one way or another. And so like whatever sort of new medical genetic technology that comes out that's going to test people for susceptibility to whatever, that's not going to make that big of an impact one way or the other on what's happening and like who lives and who dies inside the world.
Yeah.
So I wanted to go where the action is, and I don't think everyone should be like compelled for like ethically or something like that to sort of to chase the biggest burden of disease or however you want to measure it or something like that. But I do think there's a collective responsibility at the discipline level at the very least, maybe more than that. But I've made the case inside a paper that there is a sort of a discipline-wide obligation to basically to deal with some of these issues. So like to be socially engaged and to be socially responsible, because at least in epidemiology, I find it especially interesting where there's not a sense that that philosophers of epidemiology or philosophers of public health or whatever, that there's some sort of like discipline level obligation to do certain things, whereas people who work inside epidemiology or public health or whatever see themselves as being bound by incredibly intricate and complicated and very forceful codes of ethics, formal ones and informal ones. Like I have like they have obligations to try to create more just worlds or something like that. And I think philosophers of science and philosophers of public health or whatever, we also have we have some of those obligations too, and it's more complicated. But
right.
Yeah, how are we going to deal with this among so many other things like climate change and all sorts of other social problems, like how and when and why? But like we just sort of being on the sidelines and having no obligations to anybody, I think is not a tenable position for philosophy in general.
Fair enough. Okay. Well, Dr. Sean Valles, Sean, thank you so much for taking the time out of your Tuesday evening to chat. It's been a real pleasure. I've learned a tremendous amount, thank you very much. And hopefully, we'll see you at the next socially engaged philosophy of science meeting, and whenever that might be. But in the meantime, be well and be safe out there at East Lansing. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you very much. Be well.
Bye.